I would like to focus quite sharply in our comments on policy implications. So Nathan, you gave us, I thought, a phenomenal description of how culture and history had influenced the efficacy of certain developmental policies. I'd like you to pick up on that and put on your hat not of someone explaining why the policies didn't work, but perhaps tell us something about how you could change the circumstances so that the policies would work. So if you went back to those places, how would you advise people to do things differently, given that we now know why the policies didn't work? So you can choose any of those examples.
Okay, great. So let me talk specifically about the examples, and then I'll give actually one other one if I have a few minutes. So why didn't the colonial policies work? So they worked. There's two things when you ask, does a policy work? One is, did we accomplish our objectives to vaccinate 90% of children or not? So and then that's what's typically measured. The other thing, when you're trying to understand did a policy work, is how did we change the society in other ways? Or what other unintentional consequences did we have? So in terms of what they were trying to do, you could argue the colonial medical campaigns were perfectly successful, but they actually fundamentally changed societies in a way that caused negative externalities for other groups that came in, other aid organizations. So these were very traumatic experiences. Songs were written, basically, that people sung around the campfire about these traumatic experiences. There were stories that were passed on from generation to generation, and these are basically is the transmission mechanism for these cultural views. So I guess the answer to some extent would be is easy in the sense of if you could go back in time and you were aware of these unintended consequences, maybe you would take a bit more time when you were implementing these campaigns. So I'm sure they lined people up at gunpoint just because that was the most efficient thing to do. They could vaccinate a whole village more quickly if that was the case, and they could vaccinate more of the village more in general relative to if people were just voluntarily deciding to participate. If people were voluntarily deciding to participate, you would have to explain to them what's going on, what are you doing, what's the biology in ways that they could understand, which actually might have positive externalities for those that came after, right? And so that's just one example. And then let me just give one other example of because we're exactly in our line of research exactly thinking about this question. So everything I said was kind of negative and said, oh, well, this messed things up here, this messed things up here. How can we be more proactive and actually do something positive? So a very common custom within Africa is our age set initiation rituals. So men, when they become a certain age, will go into the jungle for 6 months. They'll learn how to become a man. They'll learn how to be civic-minded. They'll learn their genealogy, et cetera. And what happens is, this is, people tell me who have been through armies, that this is a real bonding experience, like armies in Western societies. And there's lots of evidence that this is the case, that these men who are in the same cohort and go through life together as a cohort basically get strongly bonded together. Okay? And what you see in the anthropological literature is, well, these men who tend to be young serve as a check on the older elite, which are in a village, in other words, the village chief. So this is a natural cohort of young men that essentially balance the power of the political elite, which tend to be of an older cohort. And there's lots of famous examples of actually sons turning on their own father, who is the chief, and defending those, going against the father and to the defense of those within their cohort. And basically the logic is, I have more obligation, more allegiance to people of my own age than people in my own family. Okay, and so how can this be leveraged? So a very common thing in development today is community-driven development, where we go into a society, we want to set up a particular development program, we want to be inclusive, so we set up a village development committee, which monitors the chief. And in general, what we do is we have a Western mindset. This should be inclusive. It should be representative of the population, democratically elected, et cetera, and which is great. But it's often not the most natural committee and not the most natural committee to monitor the chief. So another option would be, well, there's actually pre-existing committees which exist, which are these young age sets. What if we allow them to monitor the chief on a particular development project? So some of these places within Africa have these age sets, others don't. So obviously, which policy you're going to implement might depend on that. And so you can randomize this, have a 4x4 matrix, if you want to think of it, with the young men committee versus diverse committee in age set and non-age set villages, and see, is it the case that when you just tweak, it's a tiny, tiny tweak on development policy, which is completely costless, do you actually get better outcomes in these age set villages? So that's one example where it's trying to be more positive. And so we're implementing this, and we'll see if it works. It might not, and then we've learned something. Yeah.
Just one other thing that you said really intrigued me. In your explanation for why fertilizers weren't being adopted, you gave two sets of reasons. One related to people's beliefs, and so that they thought success came, from evil behavior as opposed to actually applying the fertilizer. But then you also mentioned something which intrigues me, which I have observed in Africa as well, which has to do with this tradition of redistribution from the most successful. And it's always occurred to me that this is a kind of a confiscatory tax system. that if you do well and you have to look after all your relatives, it's surely going to reduce the incentives that you have to do well. So what kind of policies would you advise in that case?
And the redistribution,
Yeah, because that's a really tough one to kind of tackle.
Distribute copies of Hayek to all villagers.
So I guess even before that, I think the first question is, does that redistributive tax have any effects? And is that explains some of the, I think we don't even know that, and we're not really asking that question currently. And it's not obvious that it would, actually. So let's say you have a tax of 30%, 45%. Is that different than the income tax we face in the US today, and how distortionary is that? So I think we need to, before saying we need to eradicate this is doing all sorts of terrible things, we would need to understand that. And just the one thing I'll mention, which is related to, so that's a bit punting on your, because I don't know that that we want to implement a policy that discourages it, for example. There could be lots of benefits. But just one thing I wanted to mention, which is related to that, I think, and it's related to the broader discussion about immigration and in the modern context and democracy, is I think in a lot of our history, the world has been zero-sum. So in other words, there hasn't been a lot of growth, there hasn't been a lot of gain. So if one person gets more, that means somebody else has gotten less, right? So now with international trade, which in some sense our psychology is really hard to wrap our minds around, comparative advantage, both can be made better off. But historically, I think that wasn't the case. If you had land, I didn't have that land. If you had a wife, I didn't have that wife.
I can't imagine somebody who has any amount of power today who wouldn't understand the idea of comparative advantage.
Well, it depends what you mean by understand. So there's.
I'm making a joke.
Now I lost my train of thought. So I think maybe that's all I wanted to say. So that's related to two things. One is immigration. So kind of the narrative you're talking about, immigrants come in and I'm losing something. If you actually look at the data, there's no evidence. But again, would anyone in power understand this? That's another question. There's no evidence that immigrants actually come at a cost. They don't affect the wages. In the long run, they actually provide economic benefits. And so when it comes to immigration, the world is not zero-sum. That's related to redistribution. So if the world is zero-sum, someone else does better. They're doing better because someone else is doing worse. So they might be obligated to redistribute. And if you have decreasing marginal utility of welfare, the optimal allocation is to redistribute so everyone's best.
By the way, I would just comment on your observation about, well, it's equivalent to taxation, and we have taxation in our society, so this need to redistribute isn't a problem.
Might not be.
It might not be. Well, it turns out that I happen to believe that the country I originate from, South Africa, has a huge problem because there are insiders and outsiders, and the insiders get relatively high wages. But the wages are too high to actually clear the labor market. If you turn around and say, oh, you should lower the wages of the workers so that everyone could get a job, the response is, no, we can't do that because each wage has to support 10 people. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, yes, maybe in some cases it is analogous to taxation.
Yep.
But in other cases, it can be distorting the entire system.
Yeah.
So it's something that's really hard to tackle. So Yascha, I was intrigued by your analysis, mostly with which I agreed. But then I was struck by your policy prescriptions. And one of them you told us was a part of the solution is, in a sense, embodied by Barack Obama. And it did occur to me that, we had Barack Obama, and now we've got Donald Trump. Mm. And in some sense, America's response to Barack Obama, or some Americans, was Donald Trump. So why should I believe in your policy prescription?
Well, so first of all, that's not the core of my policy prescription. The core of my policy prescriptions in the book are about economic policy, and we can talk about that. But to answer your question head on, look, both times Barack Obama was on the ballot, he won resounding victories. The person who was on the ballot in 2016 was Hillary Clinton, and I don't think that she did speak about inclusive patriotism in the same kind of way. Whereas Obama made sure that all groups in America felt valorized, but always told a story of us that's about the whole nation. I think that in certain ways in the Hillary Clinton campaign, that grander vision was missing. And instead, I think there was an electoral logic at play, which, by the way, isn't just about minority group, which is basically to cobble together a majority by thinking very carefully about the particular kinds of economic and demographic groups you want to appeal to in order to add up, right? So that's obviously African Americans and Latinos, but it's also, suburban moms, and it is, affluent retirees, and you just go through all of the different kinds of groups, and a lot of her policies were directed to saying, well, this policy is really going to appeal to suburban moms, right? But when you hold a political speech in which you have to address these 15 different groups separately, by the time that you get to point 12, which supposedly is going to address suburban moms who are therefore going to go vote for you, they've switched off because they don't have an interest in the 11 other random things you've been talking about, right? So I would say in response to no, in terms of how you should talk about it as a politician, the times that Obama tried it, it worked. And what happened in 2016 in good part is the Democratic Party wasn't doing that.
That's a good answer.
Thank you.
So you made an allusion in passing that I'd like to explore in somewhat greater depth, which had to do with the economic policies that could combat these populist movements and so on. Now, I happen to also believe that United States hasn't done a very good job in helping those who've been displaced. We don't have good training programs. Our unemployment insurance programs don't work too well. I've long been an advocate of something called trade adjustment assistance and so on. But then I look at Europe and, for instance, France. And I think they probably do more of these policies than you could ever get the United States to implement. And other European countries that you describe have also seen the emergence of these populist movements. So are these economic tools really going to be effective in dealing with the problems of people who, in a sense, want to return to their old way of living, want to retain their jobs? Are they going to be satisfied, with being told or even helped to retrain and to relocate?
So first of all, I'm but a humble political scientist in a room full of distinguished economists, so I know that I'm speaking, a little out of turn. But I do think, well, two points. The first is about, is it going to be enough? I can't promise you that, right? I mean, as you were alluding to earlier, for most of human history, we lived in societies with very stagnant economic growth. And those set not just the imagination of people, the moral ideas of people, but also political structures. And they weren't very conducive to things like liberal democracy. Now, for the last 250, 300 years, we've had very rapid economic growth, and that set the stage for something like liberal democracy to be able to work. When you think of Europe, in 1950, a lot of Europeans didn't have central heating in their home, certainly didn't have a car, didn't have a television, lived in very cramped quarters. And 25, 30 years later, they had central heating and 2 cars and a home entertainment system, right? Under those circumstances, it was easy to sustain democracy because people felt like, well, obviously the system is delivering for us. Over the last 30 years, that hasn't happened in the same way. Even though I agree with you that a lot of the self-inflicted wounds that America has, Europe does not, people don't look, look, people in my generation, I'm 35, I didn't look at my childhood and think, wow, I feel like the world has transformed economically in the last 30 years. The things that my generation now gets to do is completely unlike what we knew as children. That's just not the case, right? So there's a big macroeconomic question here, which I don't really have the answer to, about whether this is a particular development of the last 30 years from a technological revolution not really having had its effects on productivity growth yet, and so on and so forth, or whether this is the new normal, whether we're actually just going to have quite, secular stagnation, quite slow economic growth. And if that's the case, then all of the best economic policies in the world may not be enough to save the bacon, right? Now, I do think, however, that there's lots of things that European countries can do to distribute to both maximize the gains they can have from globalization and distribute the fruits better. So just let me talk you through a couple of straightforward points. Taxation. On this, the United States gets it right. If you're a US citizen, you have to pay tax in the United States irrespective of where you live. If you're on a beach 200 days a year, have fun, go enjoy the Bahamas, you still got to pay tax here. That's not the case in any European country. I think that's a mistake. Now, you have double taxation treaties to make sure that if you live in a high-tax country, you don't end up also having to pay tax. That makes sense. But if you're going to go and spend 200 days on a beach in a low-tax country in order to avoid paying your dues to the society in which you made your money, that's not okay. We can change that. More broadly, you need to ensure that you have territorially based taxes for corporations to a certain degree, so that it doesn't matter whether your nominal headquarters is in Boston or Delaware, or for that matter in Dublin or Luxembourg or Berlin. And there's ways of doing that. You need to do a lot more against people hiding the money, whether it is individuals in tax havens or corporations. And part of that is just to invest more money into tax authorities and to be more serious about putting people in prison when we do hide their money. Because when billionaires think, hey, I save a little bit on tax and I might actually sit in prison for 20 years, they're not going to do it. Right? So that's one set of things. The other set of things is about productivity growth. Right? So the Obama White House had a great study that shows that if we were now at the levels of equality that we had in 1960, 1970, the average wage of Americans would be 25% higher. That's a lot. But if we had had the productivity growth over the past decades that we had in the post-war decades, the average American would now have twice as high an income. Right? And there's a ton of things that European countries can do to boost productivity. Well, it's very difficult to boost it hugely, but there's certainly a lot of missed opportunities. Germany, for example, has finally put on a program for excellence in higher education that actually rewards universities that have particularly centers of renown. Its annual budget is lower than the operating budget of this university here. Right? Germany could do a ton more to invest.
You mean very high?
Medium high. Germany could do a ton more to invest in that kind of thing. And finally, when you look at people's pre-tax income, it's really stagnated. When you look at the post-tax income, it's actually gone up a little bit because there are some sensible welfare state policies. When you look at their disposable income, what they have left after they've paid for health, education, and especially housing, it's gone down in many places. And that's because of artificial scarcity. You could do a lot more to actually build a ton of homes in places like London and Paris and Munich and Stockholm, so that people who are in their 20s and have a decent job can have a sense that perhaps one day I'm going to have the same standard of living as my parents. That includes actually having somewhere to live, right? So I think there's a ton of things that European countries could do quite concretely to boost people's standard of living.
Thank you. Let's take some questions from the audience. Why don't we collect a few and then come back to our panel? Yeah. Did you have your hand up?
Hi.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's really an observation on two of the points that were made in the absolutely excellent introductory remarks. The first is on immigration, where you mentioned that there was no evidence that it comes at a cost. And my observation is you're of course completely right in what you say. But in Britain, where there is absolutely no evidence it comes at a cost, indeed there is clear evidence that the immigrant communities have actually been big contributors in taxation and not takers of welfare and so forth. And where equally there's evidence that without those those immigrants coming into Britain, our national health service would be in deep peril, and indeed a lot of the agriculture that takes place on the east coast of Britain would be in peril. So all the evidence is in support of what you said, and yet that was the driving factor that has led to this extremely divisive referendum and Britain's decision to leave. And I think it's particularly surprising because many people might not have been big fans of the European Union, but the reason why they didn't want to leave it was nothing to do with the quality of the European Union and its institutions. It was much more because the big problems of migration, terrorism, protectionism, and so forth require much more international cooperation at a time when narrow nationalism from Moscow all the way down to Cairo is on the march. And yet still, in spite of those drivers, immigration was the key factor that is driving us out of the European Union. And if I'm just allowed one other small point, you made a very interesting comment about social media, where you said that you thought the way to tackle it was not to tackle it through the law. We are very focused on that in Britain at the moment, and there's quite a strong feeling that actually you have got to find a way of tackling it through the law. You can try and find a voluntary mechanism for the distributors of social media. But in the end, because of the fact that it is being used to spread so much racial hatred and incitement, indeed, and indeed in some cases adjacent to terrorist activity, that the law will have to be used, and we'll have to get our heads around how we control and contain those very divisive and dangerous trends.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, sir? Yeah.
I would like to hear some comments moving the discussion from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. Particularly take Nathan on that comment that one-size-fits-all policy prescriptions don't really work. And then if I would compare it with the Belt Road Initiative, for example, you would see that the emphasis moves from poverty reduction to more infrastructure building, maybe somewhat short-term, long-term. Also on the economic imperatives, right, it also moves somewhat from speedy implementation as opposed to lots of feasibility studies. It moves from informal practices, which some people call corruption. It also has to do with things like environmental impact assessments, basically flexible governance, procurement, and things like that. And certainly, it's probably the largest initiative the world has seen. And I would like to hear some comments, because certainly it's not one size fits all, and therefore it's very appealing.
Okay, last, yes.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting session. Yascha, I have trouble with the interpretation that has to do with immigration and that has to do with distribution of income. Coming from Latin America, we've had a hugely successful decade of growth. Income distribution actually improved. It's the only part of the world in which it improved. And nonetheless, we are seeing a dramatic decline in the support for democracy, for liberal democracy as we know it. So we need a more universal explanation. And social media at least has the ability to be more universal. So I want to understand why do you think, what's the transmission mechanism between the ability to distribute hateful messages and the ability to distribute fake news in massive ways? What's the connection with that and the demand for populism, authoritarian populism? Is it that we need to reconstruct a homogeneous narrative, or what? And how can liberal Democrats, what can we do to fight back? Because I think there's something very valuable that we need to protect.
So, gentlemen.
You can start. You know.
Yeah, let me speak to immigration and social media, which are, I think, two themes that have come up again and again. So look, first of all, on immigration, you know, I think it's important that we distinguish a little bit between what should be a part of a legitimate political debate, even if we disagree with it, and what should be, in certain ways, off limits, and what implications that had also for the kind of policies we should have, right? So look, you know, as I said at the beginning of my speech, I'm very worried about what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary. And a response to that from parts of the political right, even in this country, is, oh, you just don't like his policies about refugees, and that's why you're, you know, not accepting that he's been re-elected by his people. Look, it's true, I don't particularly like his policy on refugees, but I think it's legitimate, right? I think that it is fine for the prime minister of a country to say we're not going to take any refugees. I might argue with him, right? But I don't think that's a violation of the rule of law. I don't think it's a violation of the separation of powers. It's not an attack on democracy. What's an attack on democracy is to cripple the press, is to take over the Supreme Court, is to close down NGOs and academic institutions, right? That's why I'm worried about it. So the first thing I just want to say is we need to tolerate a broader set of views within our societies without saying, you know, that's so illegitimate it can't be said. And in the United States, you know, I'm in favor of continuing to have a good bit of immigration, especially a good bit of high-skilled immigration. But I think it's fine for people to say that they disagree, and we shouldn't sort of try to shut them up, right? That's one thing. The other thing is that I think there's a big distinction between people's desire to have control over the border and what the substantive views are and who we should then let in. And I think that we need to, if we want to manage the anti-immigrant sentiment, we need to show people that we have control over borders, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then we can win the debate to have more immigration, at least in certain categories. And then the third question is that something I'm still thinking through on this question is whether we should push for our preferred policies or whether we should take the political reaction to those policies into account. If I thought about my preferred policies, I would say, you know, probably the United States should have roughly the level of immigration it has now. Probably the nature of it should change a little bit. But I personally don't see any great urgency in reducing the amount of immigration in the United States. When I think about the effect it might have, I'm more torn, because it's quite striking that the last big wave of xenophobia in the United States was about 100 years ago, when the rate of foreign-born citizens was, or foreign-born residents was about what it is now. And then there was a much more restrictionist immigration policy, and passions calmed, right? And I don't know how to think through that, but it's very suggestive and it troubles me, and it does make me think about whether I should desist from my personal preferred policies because of the political effects in the long run that I assume they might have. On social media, well, let me say first of all, I don't know Latin America as well as some other regions in the world, right? I mean, In Poland and Hungary and a lot of Central Europe, my explanation doesn't straightforwardly work either, but I still hold to it because I think that a version of it works, which is to say that, you know, in those Central European countries who've had a rapid improvement of living standards over the last 25 or 30 years, that people were promised, first of all, convergence with Western Europe, which didn't happen. Secondly, the split between town and country has in some ways even increased, which led to a lot of resentment in the country. And thirdly, a lot of the people who most profited from those economic transitions were often post-communist elites who were seen as illegitimate. So people feel like the distribution you have is deeply unfair. And you take those three things together, and you do get a quite powerful economic story there as well. Now, I don't know whether some version of that might apply to Latin America or not. I'd love to talk about it afterwards. But I wonder whether there's some equivalent story of people saying, yeah, I'm doing better, but really, I've not gotten what I've promised. And the other thing, of course, is that populism, unlike in Western Europe and North America, has been more deeply endemic in Latin America for a longer time, right? So there may be less to explain because what you're seeing is just a flaring up of something that's always been present in a certain kind of way in Latin America. But on the broader question on social media, first of all, to make clear, I do think there needs to be a government response. And I do think that we need to regulate various things about social media. And one of the obvious things we need to regulate is that people treat data that is supposed to be confidential confidentially, and that they see real punishment when they don't, right? So there's all kinds of aspects in which government policy is needed. I just don't think that government censorship of content of speech is a very helpful response, right? So I don't think the government should be in the business of saying you're not allowed to say that. That's a specific objection to what the government shouldn't do. More broadly, what is the mechanism? Well, I think one of the mechanisms is a destabilization of respect for institutions and trust in institutions. It becomes easier and easier to spread conspiracy theories, to say that your politicians don't really care about you anyway, to make a huge thing of scandals that are actually relatively small. And you take all of that together, and I think social media can drive this deep distrust of a political system, but then leads to a rise of anti-system candidates.
Okay. So I'll try and make this quick just so we can get to more questions. Just two things. One is, so I think the comment on immigrants is fascinating, actually, just from a purely academic point of view. So there's all this evidence of all these benefits of immigrants, and you can point to them, they're very tangible, but people still have this gut visceral reaction that I don't like immigrants, or at least a subsection of the people. And I think, that's in terms of our psychology, I think people, their gut reactions motivate them a lot in voting, more so than reading studies and calculating these things rationally. So I think this is super interesting to think about. I guess John Haidt's here, who's written about this, knows 100 times more than me. But if we think of the history, or I'll talk about the evolution, historically, this in-group, out-group distinction was super important. So I think if you think of small-scale societies, even large-scale societies, there's a lot of intergroup competition, villages raiding other villages, nation-states fighting other nation-states. And when you have this intergroup competition or the threat of external invasion, then this causes people to act in a way that's beneficial for the society as a whole, even though it might not be beneficial for them, so in pro-social ways. So actually, this in-group, out-group distinction leads to a lot of benefits and was really, really important. And you could think of, one heuristic or rule of thumb is, people outside my group are evil, I hate them. People inside my group are good. And that's actually going to lead to a lot of good, evolutionarily beneficial behavior, right? Even though that's a completely false narrative and that's a false view, it's going to cause you to engage in pro-social activities, to bond with fellow people within your group, and actually engage in actions, even though it's a false belief, that are evolutionarily beneficial. So I think this is probably a big chunk of the foundation of why in-group, out-group, migrants versus non-migrants are so important. And as John's written about, there's heterogeneity, and this is super important for politics. And Ben Enke, who's here, has a paper on how this then manifests itself in politics. And then just the other thing is, I won't, maybe we can talk afterwards about the specifics of the project you have in mind. I think just two things. One is, you mentioned speedy implementation, and then other effects of projects. I think a lot of this is, what are the incentive incentives of NGOs. So what are they trying to maximize? And it's basically getting the next contract. So they want to successfully finish the project that they're on to get the next contract. And we're barely even just evaluating now the target of these projects, let alone all these other costs. And also they want to maximize speedy implementation, which comes at the cost of potentially these other things. And so, but maybe we can talk after as well.
If I could usurp the chairman's prerogative on this, it is a bit of a mixed metaphor to think about one belt, one road as not everything fits all. Actually, I think using Nathan's methodology, if you looked at the effects of the Chinese Tanzam Railroad, which was built in the 1970s and failed to understand the context in which it was being built, so that they built the railroad, but the people didn't respond to the railroad or operate the railroad and maintain it in the way it had been expected, you can see that infrastructure necessary, but certainly not sufficient. Let's just get a couple more questions. Yeah.
Question for Nathan and for Yascha. Yascha, is there such a thing as an index of democracy? I'm asking because I talked to an OAS member. I said, well, why don't you declare Venezuela non-democratic? And said, no, we can't do that because of this and that and the other reason. And so, number one, it seems to me that the best guardians of democracy would be the other states, but that is a very difficult thing. But at least at the academic level, have some ideas of what do we have a line across which we don't pass. So that's a question. The other question for Nathan is, it seems natural to say, okay, there are all these experiments going out there of all these social interventions. Can we rank them in terms of variance? That is, which kind of experiments are there that seem to be fairly cultural neutral, and which kind of experiments really do require more information before implementation takes place?
Thank you both for the presentations. I wanted to get back to the underlying reasons of social discontent. Inequality is obviously something, the Piketty line and the increasing divergence of the 0.1%. I mean, we're focusing now on 0.1%, right? I mean, and it's close to 50% of the ratio. But that's just a number. In some countries, and I think Latin America, from where I come from, I think it is a reason, is the way in which that difference is made matters. In the sense of that it is not Schumpeterian, product of talent, perspiration, inspiration, if you will, but it has more to do with rent-seeking and corruption. And I haven't heard a lot of that being said. I would like to hear the thoughts on that.
Should we take more questions, or
I think we need to end.
Yeah. So I'll just on the first question, maybe I'll just say a quick comment since we're running out of time. Is I think that's a great idea of what kind of interventions are more culturally neutral. I don't think any are culturally neutral. So if you thought of something, we had the example of infrastructure, transportation infrastructure just now. You'd think, well, that's just engineering, but the implementation is super important, how people are going to use it. I think it's a great idea. I think health is probably one where it's going to be most culturally sensitive, maybe education, and so I think that's so it will be someone's next research project. So thank you.
A few quick thoughts. So yeah, on legitimacy, I think you put better than I could what I was trying to say about Poland and Hungary and sort of extending to Latin America, which is to say that what matters is not just your economic fate and it's not just the degree of inequality, it's about whether you think that the economic distribution is legitimate. And that depends in good part on the source of wealth that affluent people have, right? And it's very different to look at Elon Musk is really rich. Well, he's done something in his life versus some of the people who are really rich, frankly, in Latin America, or for that matter, Central Europe, right? On the democracy index, yes, that exists, of course. I don't understand the specific reasons why the Organization of American States can't call Venezuela a dictatorship. I imagine that's to do with their membership and their funding. But there's a great organization, for example, by the name of Freedom House, that chronicles very clearly how democratic each country is. Venezuela on that metric is very clearly marked non-free as of the last years. And the striking thing, as Larry Diamond at Stanford has pointed out, is that for the last 12 years, we've been in what's called a democratic recession. So for each of the last 12 years, more countries have moved away from democracy than have moved towards it. And that tells you something about the stakes we now face.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our session, but we've had a terrific session, so please join me in thanking our participants.